Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we're going to do something very cozy, very slow, and a little depressing. We're going to talk about food in the Middle Ages. And spoiler alert, it was mostly terrible. Like, really terrible. So dim the lights, grab a snack if you dare, ideally not something made of pottage, dried peas, or mystery salted fish. And let's float back about 700 years to a world where the definition of fine dining meant no mold this time. Because you see, medieval food has this sort of glossy movie-style image. Knights feasting in castles, roasted boars with apples in their mouths, goblets of wine flowing like a frat party in chainmail. But real life, let's just say your average medieval dinner would make airplane food look like Michelin star cuisine. And the funny part is, even the rich weren't exactly eating well. Sure, they had more food, but more does not always mean better. It often meant more meat covered in suspicious spices, served at room temperature. So let's start with the basics. Bread. If you were a medieval European, bread was your everything. Not in a trendy sourdough Instagram way, more like if you didn't eat bread, you probably didn't eat at all. We're talking 50 to 70% of daily calories coming from bread. White bread, brown bread, rye bread, barley bread, and oat bread. And when I say white bread, don't imagine fluffy baguettes. No, it was dense, coarse, and about as fun to chew as a brick. People literally referred to the staff of life because without bread, you collapsed like a bad Jenga tower. And of course, bread quality depended on your social rank. The nobility had something called manchet, a fine, pale bread sifted to get rid of all the weird little husks. The peasants, on the other hand, were stuck with bread that sometimes had beans, peas, acorns, or literally ground up tree bark mixed into it. Yum. Nothing like a nice slice of forest loaf to make you wonder why you were born. Now, let's talk about meat. Because everyone loves to imagine medieval banquets piled high with roasted venison, boars, swans, and whatever else was unlucky enough to exist within the local forest. And yes, technically, the rich did eat meat. But here's the thing. It wasn't refrigerated at all. You might get a roasted goose on the day it was caught, but a lot of the time, meat was preserved, salted, dried, smoked, which meant it tasted less like succulent roast and more like licking a piece of wood that someone spilled brine on. And don't even get me started on fish, because the church said no meat on fasting days, which were basically half the year, so people turned to fish. But again, preserved fish, salt cod, pickled herring. Imagine opening a barrel that had been sitting for months in a damp cellar and pulling out your dinner. That was Tuesday. And you might be thinking, but hey, what about fresh vegetables? Surely the peasants had gardens. Yes, they did. And here's where the word pottage comes in. Pottage was the all-purpose medieval stew. You throw in water, maybe some barley, maybe a handful of onions, leeks, peas, or turnips, and then just keep it simmering for days, sometimes weeks. People literally called it perpetual stew because you never actually emptied the pot. You just kept topping it up. So your soup might have been started by your grandmother, and now you're just adding cabbage. Honestly, it was the medieval version of leftovers, except the leftovers never left. And spices? Oh yes, spices. Medieval people loved spices, not because they were fancy flavor connoisseurs, but because spices were one of the only ways to make rotten meat taste less like death. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, all imported, all expensive. Rich nobles dumped absurd amounts of spice into their dishes, partly to show off their wealth, partly because otherwise the venison they were serving might smell like a wet dog. Speaking of nobles, let's address the crazy royal feasts. They weren't just about eating, they were basically flexing. You'd invite people over, serve a pie filled with live birds. Yes, that was a thing. Or a roasted peacock served with its feathers reattached. It wasn't about taste. It was saying, look at me, I am so wealthy, I can literally waste resources on nonsense. Medieval banquets were the food version of wearing Gucci head to toe, but never washing it. And yet, despite the big show, a lot of nobles were perpetually sick from their diets. Gout was the disease of kings. Too much red meat, too much wine, too much sugar when they could afford it. Basically, medieval nobles lived in constant digestive misery. But hey, at least they looked impressive while eating their 15th goose leg. Now, let's float over to one of my favorite medieval food tragedies, beer and ale. Today, you might think of beer as this crisp, refreshing beverage. Medieval beer? Not so much. It was thick, cloudy, low alcohol, and often went sour within days. People drank it all the time, though, because water was basically a bacterial soup. Even children drank ale, because better to be tipsy than dead of dysentery. But imagine living your life constantly sipping this warm lump, porridge-like liquid that tasted vaguely like damp straw. That was hydration. And wine? Well, wine was for the rich, especially in Northern Europe. But let's not kid ourselves. Medieval wine wasn't aged in fancy cellars. It was often sour, spiced up with honey, herbs, or whatever was lying around. People literally called it hypocras when they dumped a bunch of spices in to cover the flavor. Honestly, it was more like medieval sangria gone wrong. And then there's the fun little detail of table manners. Because medieval people did not have forks. Forks were considered weird and effeminate for centuries. So everyone just ate with their hands or with a knife or with a piece of bread as a scoop. Communal bowls, shared cups, fingers everywhere. Hygiene wasn't exactly their strong suit. So if you were dining with the local baron, you were basically sharing his germs too. Medieval feasts were basically one big petri dish with venison on top. But perhaps the saddest part about medieval food wasn't just the lack of variety or refrigeration. It was the constant threat of famine. Because if the harvest failed, which it often did thanks to bad weather, pests, or war, people didn't have a safety net. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions of Europeans. People literally ate cats, dogs, horses, and according to some records, the occasional corpse. So yeah, next time you complain about your pizza being late, just remember that your medieval ancestors might have been gnawing on tree bark during a long winter. And this is where the irony really hits. Medieval people celebrated feasts and fasts constantly, but both were kind of miserable. A feast meant too much rich, greasy food that made you sick. A fast meant weeks of dried fish and cabbage water. There was no happy middle ground. Either you were bloated on goose fat or you were praying for Lent to be over so you could finally taste the sausage again. So, yeah, medieval food sucked. And yet, this was daily life. People got used to it. They didn't know any better. To them, a bowl of warm pottage after a long day in the fields was comforting. A hunk of bread with a smear of cheese was a good lunch. And maybe, just maybe, if the local lord threw a feast, you'd get a taste of something exotic like roasted crane or almond milk pudding. We'll keep drifting through these strange culinary details in the next section. But for now, just picture yourself sitting in a smoky hall, holding a hunk of rye bread, dipping it into a pot of mystery stew and thinking, yeah, this is fine. Because for medieval people, it really was. All right, so we've established that medieval food wasn't exactly winning any Michelin stars. But let's step a little deeper into the kitchen. And by kitchen, I don't mean the cozy, Pinterest perfect idea you might have. No, medieval kitchens were more like smoke-filled caverns where everything smelled permanently of burning fat. Castles had these enormous kitchens with giant hearths, multiple spits, cauldrons, and ovens that required entire teams of servants to run. The head cook, usually some grumpy guy who had been yelled at by nobles his entire life, oversaw dozens of kitchen boys. Their job? To chop, fetch water, pluck geese, and most importantly, turn the spit. Because roasting meat required someone to stand there for hours, cranking it slowly. Sometimes they use a dog or even a goose in a treadmill to turn the spit automatically. Imagine being the dog hired to roast someone else's dinner. Honestly, medieval employment opportunities were bleak. And it wasn't just castles. Even small manors or monasteries had kitchens that doubled as smoky infernos. Ventilation was questionable. Windows? Not really. Chimneys? Sometimes. Cooks were basically marinated in smoke for their entire careers. And then there's the fire hazard issue. Medieval kitchens caught on fire all the time. Because when you're cooking in giant wooden structures with open flames surrounded by straw and grease, what could possibly go wrong? Now, the food itself. Let's talk recipes. Medieval cookbooks exist. Yes, they actually wrote them down, though they were meant for professional cooks in noble households, not your average peasant trying to make his bark bread less depressing. And these recipes are fascinating. They usually start with, take your meat. No quantities, no times, just vibes. A lot of boil it well and season to taste. Honestly, they read less like instructions and more like riddles. One recipe calls for almond milk stewed with eel. Another for a pie filled with rabbits, pigeons, and literally anything else they had lying around. And then there's blanc manger, which sounds like some medieval dessert, but nope. It was chicken boiled until mushy, mixed with rice, milk, and sugar. It came out pale and gloopy, hence the name white dish. Delicious. Speaking of almond milk, yes, they had it. Not because they were health-conscious vegans, but because dairy went rancid in about 2 hours. Almond milk was shelf-stable, so rich people used it constantly in stews and sauces and puddings. Somewhere, a medieval cook was inventing the first overpriced latte without even realizing it. But while the nobles experimented with fancy dishes, the peasants were just trying to survive. They rarely saw meat outside of holidays. Their daily meals were bread, pottage, maybe some cheese if they were lucky, and beer. And when the harvest was bad, forget it. In times of famine, peasants literally dug up roots and weeds to eat. There are records of people grinding up ferns to bake into bread. Spoiler, it was poisonous. People still ate it. And here's where we get to fasting, because if famine didn't get you, the church would. Medieval Europe had a ridiculous number of fasting days: Lent, Advent, Fridays, Wednesdays, various saints' days, and some places up to 150 days of year where meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, which meant fish. Endless fish, salted, dried, pickled. If you were rich, maybe you got sturgeon or lamprey. If you were poor, you got herring. And after your 300th herring, you probably wanted to throw yourself into the river just to escape it. There's a fun little anecdote about King Henry I of England. He loved lampreys, which are basically horrifying eel-like fish that look like something out of a nightmare. He ate so many lampreys that his doctors begged him to stop. He didn't. He died after eating a surfeit of lampreys, which is just a fancy way of saying too many slimy eels killed the king. That's medieval cuisine in a nutshell. But fasting wasn't all misery. It actually created a lot of food innovation. Since you couldn't use butter, cooks got creative with oils and almond milk. Since you couldn't use meat, they turned to fish in pies, fish in sauces, fish pretending to be meat. There are even recipes for fake eggs made of almond paste with the yolk of saffron, which sounds impressive until you realize it's still almond paste pretending to be breakfast. Now let's float over to desserts. Yes, they had them. Sort of. Sugar was insanely expensive, imported from the Middle East, so most people never tasted it. Honey was more common. Nobles would have candied fruits, sweetened wine, or spiced cakes. Peasants, they might have porridge with a drizzle of honey if they were lucky.
Fun fact, most medieval people had terrible teeth, not from sugar, but from chewing gritty bread. The millstones used to grind flour shed tiny particles of stone into the dough, which slowly filed your teeth down to nubs. Sleep tight with that image. And speaking of drink again, let's go back to ale because honestly, it was everywhere. Brewing was often women's work. They brewed in small batches at home, then sold the extra. Alewives became so common that they got a reputation in medieval art and literature as these loud, slightly shady characters. Some towns even had regulations on how strong ale could be, and they literally had ale tasters as official jobs. Imagine getting paid to sip bad beer and complain about it. Truly a dream career. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks took brewing to the next level. They had the resources to refine their recipes, and some of our modern beer traditions actually trace back to them. So if you enjoy Belgian ales today, thank a medieval monk who just wanted something decent to drink during Lent. Of course, not all medieval drinks were depressing. They had mead, honey wine, which was sweet and strong. They also had cider, pear cider, and all sorts of fruit wines. Again, nothing like what you'd get in a bottle today, but at least it didn't taste like pond water, usually. Now, let's glide back into the noble dining hall because the theatrics of eating are worth a mention. Picture this: long trestle tables covered with cloths, candles everywhere, minstrels playing in the background. Everyone seated according to rank because God forbid you put the wrong knight next to the wrong duke. Trenchers, which were basically thick slices of stale bread, served as plates. You'd pile food on them, let the juices soak in, and when you were done, you either ate the trencher or tossed it to the dogs. Sometimes they gave them to the poor, which sounds generous until you realize it was just soggy bread. And servants brought in course after course: meat, pies, stews, sauces, sometimes a subtlety, which was a fancy centerpiece made of sugar, pastry, or even molded jelly. It might be a castle or a saint or a dragon. Pure decoration, rarely eaten. It was medieval edible art, sort of like spending hours piping frosting onto a cake, then throwing it in the trash. And the rules of the table, let's just say they were different. Don't lick your knife. Don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth. Don't spit across the table, which means, yes, people were absolutely doing those things. Manuals of etiquette had to remind diners not to pick their teeth with their knives or drink directly from the communal soup pot. Nothing says fine dining than please stop dunking your bread in the gravy pot, Lord Richard. So when we put all this together, smoky kitchens, endless fish, almond milk, trenchers, perpetual stew, you start to see the full picture. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic, it was survival. Even for the rich, it was about showing off, not savoring. And for the poor, it was about filling your stomach with whatever didn't kill you.
So, by now, we've trudged through the smoky kitchens, the endless fasting days, and the general disappointment of medieval dining. But you might still be thinking, okay, but why did people eat this way? Didn't anyone notice their food sucked? Well, yes and no. And here's where things get a little weirder. Because medieval people didn't just eat what was available. They ate according to rules. Not practical rules like don't eat rotten meat, but rules based on humorism. Ah, yes, the old medical theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. The idea was that your body was basically a soup, and staying healthy meant balancing the ingredients. If you were feeling sluggish, you were phlegmatic. Too angry? Too much yellow bile. Depressed? Black bile. Happy? That was the blood talking. And food, of course, was believed to directly affect these humors. So meals were carefully categorized as hot, cold, moist, or dry. A chicken was considered
moderately warm and moist, so good for most people. Beef was cold and dry, better suited for strong, hot-tempered men. Lettuce, cold and wet, so it supposedly calmed you down. Basically, medieval dietitians were prescribing salads to anxious nights long before kale smoothies became a thing. This led to some very strange recommendations. Doctors might say, if you're melancholy, eat a lot of chicken broth. Or if you're too lustful, avoid spicy foods, which may explain why some monks lived on plain peas and bread. Nothing says celibacy like boiled legumes. And of course, nobles took this very seriously, because when you're rich and constantly sick from overeating, you'll believe anything that promises balance. Banquet menus were often arranged to alternate between hot and cold dishes, wet and dry. You might start with fruit, cold and wet, then have roasted meats, hot and dry, followed by fish, cold and wet again, and so on. It was like a medieval tasting menu designed by a horoscope. Now, speaking of sickness, let's drift into the darker side of food safety, because as much as we laugh about rotten meat, medieval food could actually kill you. Storage was primitive, rats were everywhere, grain bins were basically rodent buffets. And remember ergot, that nasty fungus that grows on rye? Yeah. Whole villages could eat contaminated bread and end up hallucinating, convulsing, or dying. Historians think some outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, where people's limbs literally rotted off, were caused by ergot poisoning. Imagine biting into your daily bread and then watching your neighbor lose a finger. Bon appetit! Water wasn't safe either. Rivers and wells were full of waste. That's why people leaned so heavily on ale and wine, not because they wanted to party 24/7, but because their other option was cholera. And yet, they still used water in cooking, stews, porridges, soups, which means, yeah, people probably lived with low-level food poisoning most of their lives. Constant stomach aches, diarrhea, fatigue. Medieval life was one big stomach bug experience. And here's where we hit one of my favorite little ironies: food laws. Medieval towns loved regulating what people ate. Bakers were inspected to make sure they weren't shortchanging customers on bread weights. Ale was tested for strength. Markets had rules about the freshness of meat, though freshness was relative. There were even assizes of bread and ale, official documents dictating fair prices and portions. Imagine a whole legal code built around making sure your loaf of barley bread wasn't half sawdust. Of course, cheating happened constantly. Bakers mixed chalk, sand, or beans into flour. Butchers sold meat from diseased animals. Alewives watered down their product. Everyone was hustling to make a profit, and everyone else was just hoping they didn't die of dysentery. Honestly, not much has changed, except now we call it fast food. Now, let's float gently toward the animal situation, because medieval people had a very different relationship with livestock. Today, you go to the grocery store, pick up some nicely wrapped chicken, and that's that. Back then, your dinner was alive in the yard until it wasn't. Pigs roamed freely in towns eating garbage. Chickens scratched around, occasionally stolen by neighbors. Cows were valuable, so you didn't just eat them. You used them for milk until they dropped dead, and then you turned them into beef jerky. Meat wasn't central to peasant life. It was more like a rare bonus, unless you counted salted herring as meat, which, let's not. But in the noble world, animals got, well, fancy. Hunting was a status symbol. Nobles had entire parks stocked with deer, boars, and rabbits, all reserved for their table. Poaching by peasants was a serious crime because, God forbid, anyone else enjoy some venison. And when nobles hosted feasts, they showed off with exotic animals, swans, cranes, even porpoises. Not because they tasted good. Swan meat is apparently awful, but because it was impressive. It's like serving your guests gold-plated hot dogs. The point wasn't flavor. It was spectacle. And the spectacle extended to presentation. Remember those peacocks with their feathers reattached? There were also dishes dyed bright colors with saffron, parsley, or even crushed flowers. Imagine a chicken dyed blue just to look interesting. That was dinner. They also loved jellies, meat jellies, fish jellies, anything that could be boiled down and molded. Gelatin was a flex because it took hours of boiling animal bones. Nobles basically invented aspic, and yes, it was just as gross then as it is now. Meanwhile, back in peasant land, dinner was still pottage, maybe with some beans, maybe with the bone for flavor if you were lucky. The contrast was ridiculous, and yet, ironically, peasants probably ate healthier diets overall. Less meat, more vegetables, fewer lampreys clogging their arteries. Medieval nobles may have had the swan pies, but the peasants weren't dropping dead of gout at 30. Small victories. Now, let's float gently into the world of superstition, because of course, medieval people believed food had magical properties. Garlic was supposed to ward off evil spirits. Certain herbs were linked to love spells. Bread blessed by a priest could cure illness. And sometimes people used food in actual medical treatments. For example, placing a roasted onion on your chest to treat coughs, or drinking wine mixed with powdered pearls for strength. Spoiler, it mostly made you poorer. And even dining habits had rituals. Nobles washed their hands before and after meals, not because they cared about germs, but because clean hands were a sign of refinement. Saying grace before eating wasn't just religious, it was also practical. You thank God that the food on the table probably wouldn't kill you immediately. Probably. But one of the strangest things, the obsession with order. Who sat where? Who got served what? Who carved the meat? In noble households, carving was a literal skill taught to young gentlemen. Manuals described how to cut each animal properly, with special terms for every movement. It was like medieval performance art with a knife. Imagine being told you weren't manly enough because you couldn't slice a goose the proper way. That's pressure. And speaking of carving, let's not forget cutlery. We mentioned forks being taboo. Well, knives were essential. Everyone carried their own. Spoons were common too, especially for soups and stews. But forks didn't catch on until the Renaissance, and even then people complained they were unmanly. Which means, for centuries, meals were basically finger food chaos, with a few spoons tossed in. It must have been like dining with toddlers, but in velvet. So when we put this all together, the humorous diet charts, the rat-infested grain bins, the endless fasting rules, the swan pies, the blessed garlic, it starts to make sense why medieval food has such a mixed reputation. It wasn't all misery, but it definitely wasn't a feast fit for a Netflix drama either. And yet, somehow, it kept people alive. Which really was the point. You ate what you had, you followed the rules, you hoped your bread wasn't moldy, and you carried on. It's not glamorous, but it's history. So we've established that medieval food was, at best, tolerable, and at worst, a prolonged stomachache waiting to happen. But food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying alive. Oh no, it also carried enormous symbolism. Eating wasn't private, it was performance, especially for the nobility. A banquet wasn't just dinner, it was a statement. Every dish that hit the table was meant to say something about wealth, power, or piety. Take, for example, those bizarre animal presentations. A roasted boar with its tusks polished, a peacock with its feathers reattached, a swan carried in wearing a crown. None of these things tasted good. But that wasn't the point. The point was, look how much money I can spend on something utterly impractical. Also, look how many servants it took to make this ridiculous dish happen. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a solid gold toilet. Even the order of service had symbolism. The higher your rank, the sooner you got fed. Guests of honor were seated closest to the Lord with the best dishes placed in front of them. The scraps, those trickled down the table or out the door to the poor. Eating was a visual map of social hierarchy. If you were at the far end of the hall, congratulations, your dinner was cold goose bones and maybe some cabbage. And then there were the religious layers. Every feast for a saint's day or a holy holiday had symbolic foods. Fish for fasting, lamb for Easter, special breads for Lent. Bread and wine weren't just dinner. They were tied to the Eucharist, to divine symbolism. Eating could literally be a spiritual act, which sounds profound until you remember that half the year's spiritual act was gnawing on dried herring while pretending it was holy. But nowhere did food and symbolism collide harder than in monasteries. Let's float into one of those stone-walled abbeys for a moment. Monks lived by strict rules. The rule of Saint Benedict, written way back in the 6th century, set the tone. Modest food, no meat from four-legged animals, plenty of fasting. In theory, monks were supposed to live simply. In practice, well, let's just say monasteries became famous for their food. Why? Because fasting rules were flexible. Meat from four-legged animals was banned, but what about birds? Totally fine. Fish? Absolutely. Beavers? Yes, because apparently someone decided their tails counted as fish. Otters? Also fish. Basically, if it lived near water, monks declared it wasn't really meat. Convenient. And they didn't just eat fish, they mastered it. Monks managed huge fish ponds stocked with carp, eels, and pike. They became the aquaculture kings of Europe. Some monasteries had elaborate water systems just for raising fish. So while peasants were choking down moldy bread, monks were enjoying nicely poached trout. And of course, monasteries brewed. Beer, wine, mead. Brewing and winemaking were monastic industries for centuries, partly because safe drinking water was rare, partly because alcohol was seen as a liquid food. Monks drink a lot. In some abbeys, the daily allowance was several liters of beer per monk. Granted, it was weak beer, but still, imagine chugging 3 liters of anything every day. The cloister must have smelled permanently of barley. Now, here's the funny part. While monasteries were technically about self-denial, they often became centers of culinary indulgence. Nobles would donate land and money, expecting prayers in return. Monks used those donations to build bigger fish ponds, plant better orchards, and brew better beer. Over time, some monasteries were basically 5-star restaurants with the side of chanting. Meanwhile, let's drift back to the royal courts, where food was less about piety and more about overindulgence. Because if there's one thing medieval kings excelled at, it was eating themselves sick. We already mentioned Henry I and his fatal lamprey obsession, but he wasn't alone. Nobles and royals across Europe routinely ate themselves into early graves. Gout, known as the disease of kings, was everywhere. Too much red meat, too much sugar, too much wine. Their joints swelled, their feet burned, they could barely walk. But did that stop them from grabbing another roasted goose leg? Of course not. Take Charles IV of France. He loved elaborate feasts so much that his court was practically bankrupted by food expenses. Or Louis XIV later on, who supposedly ate 4 soups, 2 whole chickens, a pheasant, a salad, a huge slice of ham, mutton with garlic, pastries, fruit, and hard-boiled eggs in a single sitting. Imagine the indigestion. Honestly, it's a miracle any monarch managed to focus on ruling at all. And let's not forget Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who suffered from chronic indigestion and gout. His doctors tried to prescribe humor-balancing diets. He ignored them. At one point, he ate so much roasted meat that he had to have special chairs made just to prop up his swollen legs. Medieval ruling wasn't just about politics. It was about constantly being in pain from your own dinner. Now, here's where it gets a little darkly funny. Royals would hire entire medical teams to monitor their diets. And yet, the advice was based on humors, so it was usually useless. Eat more lettuce to cool your blood. Drink spiced wine to balance your phlegm. Meanwhile, the king was limping around, praying for death, but still nibbling on candied almonds. And speaking of almonds, yes, let's pause there for a second. Almonds were everywhere in medieval cooking. Almond milk, almond paste, almond sauces. It was one of the most popular ingredients of the age, especially in noble kitchens. Why? Because it was expensive. Serving almonds was like putting truffle oil on everything today. It didn't matter if it made sense in the recipe. It showed you had money. So between the almond milk, the sugar imports, the exotic spices, the endless roasts, and the buckets of wine, royal diets were basically a death wish with good presentation. Nobles might have lived shorter, sicker lives than their own peasants, but hey, at least they died with swan feathers on their plates. Now, let's float that out of the royal dining hall and into the streets, because ordinary medieval townsfolk had their own food culture too, and it was way more practical. Markets bustled with vendors selling bread, cheese, meat pies, nuts, fruits in season. Street food wasn't invented in the 20th century. Medieval people grabbed a hunk of bread and cheese from a stall, washing it down with weak ale like we grab a slice of pizza. Simple, filling, probably questionable in hygiene, but it got the job done. So, to sum up this meandering midnight feast, food in the Middle Ages wasn't just nourishment. It was hierarchy. It was religion. It was medicine. It was symbolism. It was sometimes straight up deadly. But above all, it was there. It kept people moving, even if it didn't taste good. And as we drift into the next section, we'll get into even stranger territory, how famine shaped culture, how climate shifts ruined harvests, and how ordinary people got very creative and sometimes very desperate when food ran out. Because if you thought dried fish was bad, wait until you hear about famine bread.
So far, we've drifted through smoky kitchens, fasting rules, famine, and despair. But food in the Middle Ages wasn't just sustenance or status. It was also medicine. And yes, this is exactly as frustrating, confusing, and occasionally deadly as it sounds. Humors everywhere. We mentioned the 4 humors before: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They weren't just abstract ideas. They dictated every meal, every cure, every doctor's recommendation. Feeling sluggish? Too cold and moist? Eat roasted chicken. Too hot? Eat lettuce. Gouty? Stop eating swans, start eating pears. Doctors took this extremely seriously. Every royal court had physicians who constantly dictated what the king or queen should or shouldn't eat. These weren't just casual suggestions. They were mandates. And if a ruler ignored them, well, sometimes the consequences were immediate. The case of Henry I, revisited. Remember Henry I and his fatal lamprey indulgence? That's a perfect example. His doctors tried to warn him. Lampreys were cold and moist, potentially harmful to someone with his humoral imbalance. Did he listen? Of course not. He ate them anyway. And yes, he died shortly after, probably choking on the moral lesson. Or the eels. Maybe both. Kitchens as pharmacies. Medieval kitchens doubled as pharmacies. Herbs were everywhere, not just for flavor, but for health. Sage, rosemary, thyme, and parsley were used in soups, stews, and sauces. And yes, in the same meal, they might be prescribed to treat flatulence, melancholy, or minor fevers. Monks, once again, led the way. Monastic gardens were meticulously planned. Each herb had a purpose. Fennel for digestion, chamomile for calming, lavender for headaches. The cook and the apothecary were often the same person. Stirring a pot of chicken and sage, that was dinner and medicine. Bizarre medical recipes. And the recipes could get
elaborate. One common treatment for poor digestion: boil eggs in wine, add honey and saffron, then sprinkle with almonds. Eat slowly. Allegedly, it would balance humors. In practice, it mostly left your stomach confused and your liver annoyed. Another cure for melancholy: boil lettuce, add rose water, serve with a slice of almond bread. Eat it while listening to chants. The idea was that the soothing herbs, combined with ritual, would restore balance. Results varied naturally. Some doctors prescribed spices as miracle drugs. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just luxuries for taste. They were hot in humor, able to drive out excess cold humors. Wealthy patients could afford to spice their meals into near combustion, and physicians often recommended extravagant dishes simply because the spices were deemed medicinal. And let's not forget wine. Wine was everywhere, in moderation, or in some cases, gallons per day. Red wine was warm, white wine was cool. Doctors prescribed wine for everything: stomach issues, melancholy, weakness, even fevers. If it didn't help, well, at least you were slightly inebriated while dying. Fad foods in royal diets. Now, nobles loved trends. If a famous physician said that a certain dish would prevent gout, that dish appeared at every banquet. Royal kitchens were experimental laboratories. Some of these experiments were harmless: almond milk stew, perhaps, or poached fish with saffron. And others were less so. Consider Emperor Charles V's obsessive diet modifications. He suffered from constant gout and indigestion. His physicians tried to enforce strict regimens: limited meat, careful proportions, warming spices. He ignored some of them, followed others obsessively. Result? Chronic pain, frequent nausea, and an incredibly fussy palate. But at least he was following the rules of humoral science. And then there were the bizarre extremes: using pearls, crushed gemstones, or even gold leaf in dishes as health-promoting ingredients. This wasn't luxury for luxury's sake. It was medical theory run wild. Wealthy nobles swallowed tiny fragments of rock and mineral in the hopes that it would improve digestion or purify the blood. Spoiler, it mostly just scraped their tongues. Monastic medical experiments. Back in monasteries, some cooks got creative. They experimented with new herb combinations, prepared herbal broths, and concocted restorative porridges. These porridges often had eggs, grains, and herbs, sometimes thickened with milk. The goal: feed and heal simultaneously. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. Some monk recipes were designed to treat very specific ailments. A porridge for melancholy might contain oats, saffron, rosewater, and candied almonds. A porridge for gout might include barley, vinegar, and sage. And yes, monks documented these recipes, because nothing says divine wisdom like a spreadsheet of slightly suspicious soups. Yes, you got it right. I know it sounds stupid, but trust me. Everyday peasant remedies. Even peasants took medicine seriously, though in a less luxurious way. Boiled nettles for weakness, garlic and onions for infection, herbal teas for digestion. These were practical remedies, though often flavored with superstition. A bit of charm here, a prayer there. They had cures for almost everything. Toothache? Rinse with vinegar. Fever? Drink a thin beer. Insomnia? Eat almonds before bed. And if none of that worked, well, then it was time to pray, because their pantry had run out of options. Food, emotion, and morale. Interestingly, medieval thinkers recognized the connection between mood and food, even if they framed it in terms of humors. Sad or melancholy? Eat something warm and sweet. Angry? Avoid hot, spicy foods. Sick? Eat a bland, easily digested porridge. The logic might have been flawed, but the principle was solid. What you ate affected how you felt. Banquets, even if indulgent, were meant to lift spirits. Famine breads and nettle soups, by contrast, were oppressive, which further worsened morale. This subtle understanding of psychological nutrition is something we still practice today, except now we have chocolate and Netflix instead of sage porridge. Bizarre cures you might not expect. Some foods had very specific medical reputations. Rooster combs boiled in wine to restore virility. Eel soup for melancholy. Crushed pearls in almond milk for digestive strength. Ground moles mixed into broth for mysterious fevers. And yes, people ate these things. Sometimes with good results. Sometimes with horrifying side effects. The takeaway. So kitchens weren't just about feeding people. They were about keeping people alive, or at least attempting to. Meals were designed to maintain humoral balance, heal minor illnesses, and occasionally treat chronic pain. Wealthy courts and monasteries had elaborate systems to ensure their food doubled as medicine. Peasants did the same with whatever they could forage. In a world without refrigeration, antibiotics, or even basic hygiene, food was the first line of defense against illness, and it was spectacularly inconsistent. Some meals healed, some meals poisoned, some meals made you miserable but slightly stronger, and some meals, like lamprey for Henry, ended your life entirely. So next time you sit down to dinner, remember, medieval people viewed their plates not just as food, but as medicine, status symbols, and moral instruments. And in some ways, that might be the most fascinating and sleep-inducing thing of all.
We've wandered through famine, humble porridge, medicinal meals, and overstuffed monarchs. Now let's drift into something slightly more colorful, the obsession with exotic foods in medieval Europe. Because if there's one thing medieval elites loved more than eating themselves sick, it was showing off how rare and expensive their ingredients were. Spices, sugar, and other imported delicacies weren't just flavor enhancers. They were symbols of wealth, power, and taste that was both refined and completely impractical. Spices, gold in the pantry. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These weren't groceries you picked up at a market stall. They traveled thousands of miles from India, China, and the Spice Islands. Each shipment took months, sometimes years, through deserts, jungles, and pirate-infested waters. By the time it arrived in Venice or Bruges, it cost more than a cow. And nobles used spices obsessively. You might sprinkle pepper over a roasted chicken, pour cinnamon into wine, or mix cloves into almond milk. The point wasn't necessarily taste, though yes, some people liked it. It was the sheer audacity of saying, I can afford pepper. In fact, culinary historians estimate that some banquets used more money on spices than on meat. Imagine a 5-star restaurant charging you $1,000 for paprika. Some spices had medicinal reputations too. Pepper warmed the body, ginger cured nausea, cinnamon strengthened the blood. So by eating these extravagant ingredients, nobles were fulfilling both vanity and pseudoscience. 2 birds, 1 exotic stone-carved spice box. Sugar. Sweet status. Sugar was another obsession. Unlike today, sugar was rare, imported from the Middle East, and considered a luxury even more extravagant than spices. Wealthy households used it to sweeten meats, make marzipan, or craft elaborate sugar sculptures. Yes, sugar sculptures. Bakers would construct castles, animals, or even royal portraits out of crystallized sugar. Entire banquets might include a centerpiece made of sugar, which was admired, occasionally broken off and eaten, and mostly appreciated as a status symbol. Think of it as edible IKEA furniture. Impressive, unnecessary, and very expensive. For peasants, sugar was practically a myth. Most people had never tasted it.
Honey was the closest substitute, and even that could be scarce. Medieval diets for common folk were mostly grains, legumes, and seasonal vegetables, with occasional eggs or cheese. Sweetness was rare, a luxury of the elite. Exotic meats. Spices and sugar weren't the only extravagances. Exotic meats occasionally appeared at royal feasts. We've already mentioned swans and peacocks, but there were also porpoises, cranes, geese, and sometimes camels in certain courts. These were rarely about flavor. Camels are chewy. Cranes are bland. The point was impressing guests. Some dishes were downright theatrical. At coronations or weddings, cooks might present a living centerpiece. For example, a pie with birds inside released when cut open. Guests were meant to marvel, gasp politely, and pretend they weren't horrified. Dinner was theater, performance, and propaganda all rolled into one. Logistics and trade. But how did medieval Europe even get these things? Trade routes were long and perilous. Spices traveled from Asia to the Middle East, then through Venetian or Genoese merchants to the Mediterranean, and finally overland to Northern Europe. Sugar traveled from plantations in the Mediterranean or North Africa. Exotic animals were transported by ship or caravan. Merchants made fortunes. Nobles paid in gold, land, or favors. And if a shipment was delayed or lost at sea, panic. Banquets had to be adjusted, menus rewritten, and sometimes a grand feast ended up with nothing more than boiled eggs and stale bread. Even royalty had to contend with logistics. Fancy ingredients didn't make themselves. The social function of exotic foods. Why go through all this trouble? Because eating exotic foods was about social signaling. Pepper, sugar, peacock, almond milk, these were badges of elite status. They demonstrated wealth, connections, and access to global trade networks. They weren't eaten quietly. They were displayed. At banquets, guests noticed every detail. Who had the rare saffron sauce? Who was served the imported peppered wine? Who had a sugar sculpture on their plate? Culinary knowledge became a form of social capital. Being able to pronounce exotic spices correctly was almost as important as tasting them. Mispronounced nutmeg, and you were a peasant in the eyes of the court, no matter your birth. And nobles loved to compete through food. Banquets became displays of extravagance. One lord served 50 different meat dishes. Another constructed a sugar castle. Yet another brought live swans to the table. It was a slow, deliberate way to show dominance without shedding blood. Though sometimes it led to bankruptcies, ruined estates, and general economic havoc. In fact, historians note that food competition was a subtle form of power projection. If your neighbor couldn't match your banquet, they lost prestige. Guests remembered menus, not sermons. Food absurdly became a currency of social influence. Commoners versus nobility. Meanwhile, peasants continued their simpler diets. They ate what they could grow or forage: rye, oats, barley, legumes, cabbage, beans, eggs, cheese, occasional fish. Meals were seasonal and unimaginative. Yet this simplicity was practical. It was filling, cheap, and sustained life, unlike gilded swan pies that gave nobles gout. Ironically, in times of famine, peasants' diets sometimes became even more extreme. People ate bark, weeds, and roots, as we discussed before. Nobles could indulge in exotic foods because they were insulated from scarcity. Peasants were more resilient, but had far less glamour. The cultural legacy. This obsession with exotic foods left a long cultural imprint. Spices drove exploration, sugar cultivation expanded, trade networks grew, culinary arts evolved, and the medieval fixation on status-driven dining echoes today in Michelin stars, celebrity chefs, and gourmet extravagance. Even the most mundane medieval recipes, pottage, bread, vegetable stews, were influenced by elite practices. Monks and nobles documented cooking techniques, herb combinations, and preservation methods that later influenced European cuisine. So even boring bread had a noble story lurking behind it. Drifting to dinner's end. As we drift slowly toward the next part of our journey, consider this. Medieval Europe's culinary world was a tale of extremes. On one hand, you had famine, starvation, and bark bread. On the other, sugar sculptures, peppered wine, and roasted peacocks. On one end, survival. On the other, absurd display. And everywhere, food was tied to medicine, morality, and social standing. It was a world where the mundane and the ridiculous coexisted on the same plate. A peasant gnawed at barley porridge while a noble ate saffron pheasant with almond milk sauce, wondering whether the saffron was hot or cold in humor. And as always, this world was not static. Trade, climate, religion, medicine, and sheer human stubbornness constantly reshaped what ended up on medieval tables. Every meal told a story of hunger, luxury, survival, status, and occasionally death. We've spent hours floating through famine bread, medicinal porridge, lavish feasts, and exotic spices. Now let's pause to consider something just as essential, but often overlooked: medieval beverages. Because in the Middle Ages, what you drank was just as important as what you ate, and sometimes far more complicated. Water was risky. Contaminated wells, polluted rivers, and poor sanitation meant that drinking plain water could easily make you sick. So people turned to safer, albeit intoxicating, alternatives. Enter ale, beer, mead, wine, cider, and occasionally more exotic libations. Ale. Everyday survival. Ale was the staple drink for peasants, townsfolk, and monks alike. It was nutritious, caloric, and safe to drink. Brewing killed bacteria that would have made unboiled water dangerous. A typical medieval ale was much weaker than modern beer, sometimes as low as 2 to 3% alcohol, but it provided both hydration and energy. Peasants drank ale at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was considered part of the diet rather than a recreational indulgence. Families brewed it at home or purchased it from local alewives. And yes, children drank it too, in small amounts, because a weak beer was safer than water and helped fill a growling belly. Ale was practical, but it also had ritual and social significance. Taverns became hubs of community, and monasteries brewed for local use and donation. Brewing was an art, and some monasteries even refined the craft into something approaching gourmet quality. Mead. Liquid gold. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was less common but highly prized. It was sweeter than ale, often reserved for special occasions, religious ceremonies, or feasts. Nobles loved mead because it symbolized both wealth and indulgence. Honey was expensive, and fermenting it into alcohol required time, skill, and patience. Medieval sources often link mead to celebrations, weddings, holidays, coronations. It was festive, intoxicating, and unlike ale, exotic enough to impress guests. Some recipes even added spices, fruits, or herbs, bridging the worlds of flavor, medicine, and status display. Wine. Prestige in a glass. Wine was another elite beverage. Though in warmer regions of Europe, France, Italy, Spain, it was widely consumed by all social classes. Nobles preferred wine because it signaled refinement. White, red, spiced, or fortified, wine was carefully stored in barrels or in forests. Some households even imported special vintages from far-flung regions, further asserting their wealth and taste. Wine wasn't just consumed for enjoyment. It had medicinal and moral significance. Red wine was warming, helping balance cold humors. Spiced wine could aid digestion, and wine was often mixed with herbs for therapeutic purposes. The line between dinner and pharmacy blurred once again. Interestingly, wine could also be a weapon of indulgence. Some chroniclers note that kings and nobles drank more than doctors recommended, leading to accidents, arguments, or even sudden fits of melancholy. Drinking responsibly was a skill, or at least an aspirational one. Cider and other regional beverages. In Northern Europe, apples were abundant and cider became a staple. Like ale, it provided calories and hydration. People also drank mead variations, elderberry wines, or fermented fruit juices, depending on local produce. Each region had its preferred drink, often tied to availability, tradition, and climate. The important thing, all of these beverages served a purpose beyond flavor. They were hydration, nutrition, medicine, and sometimes a social lubricant, all at once. You couldn't separate your drink from your life. Medieval Europe had no energy drinks, no bottled water, no coffee. You drank what was available or you got sick. The darker side of medieval drinking. Drinking wasn't always safe. Overconsumption of ale or wine could cause drunkenness, and drunkenness often led to accidents, fights, or even death. Beer was weak, but wine, mead, and spiced alcohol could sneak up on anyone. Some monasteries issued daily allowances to prevent monks from overindulging, a polite form of intervention. Meanwhile, counterfeit or poorly stored beverages were common. Vinegar tainted with lead, spoiled ale, or improperly fermented mead could poison the unsuspecting. If you survived famine bread, dodgy medicinal porridge, and a hurricane of spices, you still had to watch your drink. Medieval dining was perilous in ways we usually don't consider. Drinking and social hierarchy. Beverages also mirrored social status. Ale was humble, wine was refined, mead was celebratory. The type, quality, and presentation of drink conveyed rank, wealth, and taste. At banquets, wine was poured into fine goblets, mead might come in decorative tankards, and ale was often drunk from wooden mugs or horns. Even the rituals of pouring the wine, who served the wine, who drank first, who had the privilege of tasting the first sip of a new cask. Every action was observed, noted, and remembered. Drinking was another subtle theater of hierarchy. Medicine in a mug. As with food, drinks were medicinal. Spiced wine could soothe indigestion. Ale could fill the stomach when no solid food was available. Mead could lift spirits or calm melancholy. Doctors prescribed beverages to balance humors, treat illness, or support recovery. Some prescriptions sound bizarre today, mixing herbs into beer to treat fevers, adding honey and spices to wine for heart conditions, or giving weak ale to infants to calm them. Modern readers might grimace, but in a world without refrigeration, safe water, or antibiotics, alcohol-infused drinks were practical. Drinking rituals and banquets. In noble circles, drinking became ceremonial. Toasting, communal cups, and elaborate vessels turned alcohol into theater. Some banquets featured massive casks of wine with elaborate spigots. Guests might compete to drink their fill while maintaining posture, decorum, and social grace. It sounds exhausting, and probably was. Monks and clerics had more restrained practices, but were just as conscious of ritual. Ale was measured, wine was rationed, and ceremonial drinking reinforced hierarchy, piety, and social order. Even a humble pint of beer was part of a larger moral universe. A slow float to sleep. So as we drift toward the evening's end, imagine medieval Europe through its drinks. Villages sip weak ale to survive, monasteries brew strong mead to sustain labor and prayer, and nobles toast with spiced wine to display wealth and taste. Each cup tells a story of geography, climate, trade, social hierarchy, medicine, and sheer survival. And it's striking how interconnected everything was. Food and drink were inseparable from medicine, status, and ritual. Nothing was purely sustenance. Even a humble glass of ale was a microcosm of medieval life, necessity, culture, and occasional absurdity, all in one wooden mug.
So far, we've floated through famine, medicinal porridge, exotic spices, and the curious world of medieval beverages. Now, let's take a leisurely look at royal dining habits, quirks, and the oddly human side of nobility. Because even when the meals are lavish and absurd, the diners themselves often steal the show, quietly, tragically, and sometimes hilariously. Monarchs and obsessions. Royalty often had intense, peculiar obsessions with food. Henry III of England, for instance, reportedly demanded that his kitchen produce exactly 12 types of meat for every meal. Forget flavor balance, nutritional logic, or cost. The sheer number mattered. 12. Any fewer, and the king sulked. Any more, and the kitchen staff panicked. Then there's Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. His periods of mental instability extended to his eating habits. He sometimes refused to eat anything but white foods. White bread, milk, fish, all carefully arranged. Other times, he would insist on meals in complete silence or only consume food prepared by specific cooks. The kitchen became a minefield of superstitions and mania. Staff had to guess which version of Charles would appear at dinner each day. And let's not forget Edward II of England, whose love of sweet things bordered on obsession. Chroniclers note that his diet included large quantities of sugar, marzipan, and spiced desserts. Some historians suggest his health problems and early death were influenced by both overindulgence and neglect of more practical meals. Sweet, but deadly, literally. Eating for power. Royal dining wasn't just about pleasure. It was performance, a subtle assertion of hierarchy and authority. Banquets were carefully choreographed. Who sat where, who drank first, and who received which dish were all codified signs of power. A noble might be insulted if passed the lesser wine, while a court favorite received the prized vintage. Seating arrangements, serving order, even who held the napkin, were all political maneuvers in edible form. Food could also communicate status to foreign dignitaries. Hosting an elaborate feast signaled wealth, sophistication, and global connections. Sometimes these displays were absurd. Live swans, sugar sculptures, dozens of spiced meat courses. Occasionally, nobles would bankrupt themselves just to ensure that visiting royalty or ambassadors were impressed. Royal peculiarities. Medieval monarchs had personal quirks that extended into their dining habits. Some ate alone, insisting on silence. Others required music or poetry to accompany each meal. Louis XIV of France, slightly later but illustrative, had daily meals that were public spectacles, broadcasted to courtiers who stood in awkward awe.
The act of eating itself became theater, performance, and political theater rolled into one. Then there were the hygiene obsessions. Some Ruddles refused to eat with hands, insisting on elaborate utensils, while others were lax, dipping fingers directly into sauces. Some demanded food be served at precise temperatures, not too hot, not too cold, to preserve both taste and humoral balance. And if the cook misjudged the heat of a dish, disaster. Subtle, yet catastrophic. Child monarchs and fragile appetites. Child kings and queens often struggled with the pressures of royal cuisine. Their tastes were unpredictable. Some refused solid foods, surviving on milk or sweetened broths. Others demanded exotic dishes or large quantities of sugar and spices. Their caretakers, often inexperienced in both nutrition and etiquette, had to navigate whims while maintaining the delicate balance of health, politics, and courtly appearances. For example, Henry VI of England, who became king as a baby, reportedly had feeding issues complicated by illness, court intrigue, and the stress of being observed constantly. Meals became a source of anxiety for the entire household, a microcosm of royal life, fragile, performative, and oddly boring if you're narrating it slowly at 2 a.m. Eating disorders in disguise. Historians suggest that some royals exhibited behaviors resembling modern eating disorders. Excessive fasting, selective eating, or obsessive indulgence were sometimes tied to religious practices, medical beliefs, or mental health struggles. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, was reputedly extremely particular about her diet, though not exactly in the fun sense. Refusal of certain foods, reliance on specific cooks, and ritualized meals might seem trivial today, but they were highly consequential at the time. Table manners as social control. Manners were more than etiquette. They were a tool of social control. Royals and nobles trained children in precise, sometimes ridiculous rituals: how to hold utensils, how to chew without audible sounds, how to compliment the cook. Failure to follow protocol could result in social humiliation. Eating was political. Swallowing correctly, and you risked subtle ostracism. Some feasts included choreographed surprises, small theatrical performances, song, or dramatic presentations of food. Guests were expected to react appropriately, laugh at the right moment, marvel at sugar sculptures, and praise the cooks. Again, food as theater, politics, and sleep-inducing monotony all rolled together. Strange royal preferences. Some monarchs had unusual tastes. Frederick II of Sicily reportedly loved pigeon pies and spiced dormice. Richard II of England preferred white meats with delicate sauces. And as mentioned, Charles VI alternated between extremes, sometimes consuming only monochromatic meals. These quirks influenced entire kitchens. Cooks had to stock rare ingredients, learn elaborate recipes, and anticipate moods, all while avoiding royal wrath. The life of a royal cook was precarious, tedious, and underpaid, relatively speaking. Burn the almond milk sauce, and you risk both embarrassment and possibly dismissal. The psychological side of dining. Why these oddities? Partly temperament, partly culture, partly the immense stress of monarchy. Kings and queens had their authority constantly scrutinized, and meals were one of the few domains they could control absolutely. What to eat, how to eat it, and who got to eat beside them were all realms of personal sovereignty. And that control, even over something as mundane as porridge or peacock, could be a source of comfort or obsession. In some cases, dietary peculiarities were health-driven. Humoral theory, chronic illness, or susceptibility to melancholy could dictate very specific meals. In others, quirks were symbolic. Extreme indulgence, strict fasting, or selective eating demonstrated piety, status, or refinement. Every bite carried meaning. Drifting thoughts. So, as we float slowly toward the end of this chapter of culinary eccentricities, imagine the scene. A grand hall, tapestries rustling, torches flickering, nobles seated at polished tables. A young monarch refuses everything but white bread. A senior advisor whispers anxiously to the cook. A distant relative sips wine, silently judging the pumpkin soup. And somewhere a scribe records the menu for posterity. Because yes, future historians will indeed find this boringly fascinating. Even amid wealth, extravagance, and power, the act of eating remained human, fraught with idiosyncrasies, anxiety, and ritualized absurdity. The quiet tension, the minor discomforts, the obsessive attention to tiny details. These are the things that make royal dining simultaneously tragic, tedious, and oddly hypnotic.
We've meandered through famine, medicinal foods, exotic spices, royal quirks, and beverages. Now it's time to indulge ever so slightly in sweets, or at least the medieval version of indulgence. Because even in the Middle Ages, humans had a soft spot for sugar, honey, and almond paste. Sugar, luxury crystallized. As we've mentioned before, sugar was rare and expensive. It wasn't something you sprinkled freely like modern table sugar. Sugar traveled long distances from North Africa, the Middle East, or Mediterranean plantations. By the time it arrived in Europe, it was worth more than many staples. Nobles prized it not just for sweetness, but for status, spectacle, and subtle medical properties. Sugar was often shaped into marzipan, small decorative figures, or elaborate sculptures for feasts. These creations were more about display than nutrition. Think of them as edible art installations, castles, animals, saints, and abstract geometric forms. Guests would admire them for hours before cautiously nibbling. Marzipan, almond, and status. Almond paste or marzipan became a staple of elite desserts. Blended with sugar, it could be molded, colored, and flavored with rose water or saffron. In some cases, marzipan was pressed into molds resembling humans, animals, or even entire banquet scenes. These confections were festive, impressive, and slightly unnerving if you weren't expecting a sugar frog staring at your plate. The labor involved was extraordinary. Sugar had to be refined carefully, almonds had to be ground into fine paste, colors, usually derived from rare spices or minerals, were painstakingly added. It was art, medicine, and social signaling all in one. Honey, the sweet staple. For the majority of people who couldn't afford sugar, honey was the primary sweetener. Used in mead, pastries, breads, and porridges, it was relatively more accessible, but still a luxury compared to grains or legumes. Honey was also considered medicinal, good for digestion, calming for children, and useful as a topical treatment for wounds. In monasteries, honey was used creatively. Confections combined honey, nuts, spices, and occasionally fruit. These treats were less extravagant than sugar sculptures, but they were equally functional, festive, caloric, and occasionally medicinal.
Medieval pastries. Medieval pastries were often simple, though sometimes elaborate in wealthy households. Tarts and pies were common, often filled with almonds, honey, dried fruit, or spices. Meat pies could even include sweet elements like raisins or dates, blurring the line between savory and dessert. Elaborate pies might feature multiple layers, crust, filling, and decorative pastry top. Some were theatrical, pies with live birds hidden inside, released during feasts for a dramatic effect. Yes, eating a pie could involve minor chaos, squawking, and mild confusion, all part of the medieval dining experience. Sweet drinks. Sweets weren't just for solids. Honey and sugar were added to wine, mead, and spiced beverages. These drinks were both festive and functional. A spiced wine or honeyed mead could calm nerves, aid digestion, or celebrate a festival. They were also status symbols. Rare ingredients signaled wealth, taste, and global connections. Some recipes were truly elaborate. Take, for example, a spiced wine with honey, saffron, almonds, and a hint of rosewater. Each ingredient traveled vast distances, cost a fortune, and was carefully balanced to create a drink both sweet and exotic. Drinking it was less about pleasure and more about demonstrating refined taste. Royal sweet quirks. Royalty had peculiar relationships with sweets. Some monarchs preferred monochromatic desserts. Others obsessively favored almonds, sugar, or honey in every form. Young monarchs in particular could be demanding. Insistence on specific pastries, refusal of certain colors, or sensitivity to flavors. Kitchens were often on high alert to satisfy these whims. One amusing example: a queen who demanded that her almond tarts be soft, not crunchy, with precisely the right amount of honey glaze. If the texture or sweetness was off, the baker faced hours of anxious reworking. Sweetness was serious business. Medicinal desserts. Even sweets had a medical angle. Honey was often added to pastries for digestive purposes. Saffron was considered warming, and sugar itself was believed to have subtle health benefits. Monks and physicians might prescribe sweet dishes to improve mood, aid sleep, or restore balance. In other words, a sugar tart wasn't indulgence alone, it was functional therapy. Seasonal and festive confections. Sweets were also tied to the calendar. Festivals, religious holidays, and special feasts inspired unique confections. Almond cakes for Christmas, honey buns for Easter, sugar sculptures for a coronation. Each occasion had its own culinary traditions, often documented meticulously in cookbooks or monastery records. The seasonal cycle dictated ingredient availability. Dried fruits, honey, and nuts were staples during winter when fresh produce was scarce. Spices added warmth and novelty, transforming simple desserts into exotic displays. Celebration and survival intertwined on the same plate. The human side of sweet indulgence. Despite all the spectacle, sweets were also about human enjoyment. Nobles, children, and even monks occasionally allowed themselves moments of pleasure. Honey, sugar, almonds, small indulgences amidst the world of strict diets, ritualized meals, and medicinal food. In a quiet corner of the monastery, a novice might sneak a spoonful of almond paste. In a castle hall, a young princess might savor a piece of sugar sculpture, marveling at its taste and color. In both cases, sweets offered brief escape, comfort, and subtle joy, a tiny human rebellion against monotony, illness, and strict social rules. Floating thoughts. So as we drift gently toward the conclusion of this part, Imagine the sensory world. Golden honey dripping into spiced pastries. Marzipan figures arranged like miniature tableaux. Wine lightly sweetened with sugar, and ale served for practicality. Each bite, each sip was imbued with meaning, status, medicine, festivity, and occasionally simple delight. Even in a society obsessed with hierarchy, ritual, and humors, sweets offered tiny, quiet pleasures. They remind us that despite famine, obsession, and absurdity, people sought joy, however fleeting, through taste.
We've wandered through famine foods, lavish feasts, exotic spices, beverages, and even sweet indulgences. Now it's time to consider something slightly less glamorous but critically important: how medieval people kept their food from going bad. Because in a world without refrigeration, survival depended on preservation, and the methods were slow, labor-intensive, and occasionally bizarre. Salting, the ancient lifesaver. Salt was the most basic and essential preservative. Meat, fish, and even some vegetables were rubbed with salt to draw out moisture and prevent spoilage. Salted herring, bacon, and beef could be stored for months, or at least long enough to survive a lean winter. But salt wasn't cheap. It had to be mined or harvested from the sea, then transported over long distances. This made salted goods valuable. A barrel of salted pork might be worth as much as a cow. Nobles and wealthy merchants often stored large quantities, while peasants relied on local sources or smaller amounts, sometimes compromising effectiveness. Salted food had its downsides. Overly salted meat could be tough, dry, and slightly unpleasant. Combine that with the occasional mold growth or imperfect storage, and eating salted food required patience and a strong stomach. Smoking and drying. Smoking was another common method. Meat, fish, and even cheese could be hung over smoky fires to extend shelf life. Smoke acted as both preservative and flavor enhancer, adding a distinctive taste to otherwise bland rations. Drying was also widespread. Fruits, herbs, and some meats could be dehydrated and stored. Dried apples, pears, figs, and plums were staples during winter. Grains were also carefully dried to prevent mold. Dehydration required attention to detail. Too much moisture and spoilage occurred, too much sun or heat, and the food became inedible. For nobles, smoking and drying were also aesthetic choices. Smoked hams or dried fruits could be displayed at feasts as symbols of preparedness, wealth, and access to techniques that common folk might struggle to master. Pickling, vinegar, and brine. Pickling offered both preservation and flavor. Vegetables, eggs, and fish were submerged in brine or vinegar, which prevented bacteria from taking over. Cabbage, onions, cucumbers, and even small fish like sprats were commonly pickled. Pickle goods were often tart, salty, and acidic, perhaps an acquired taste, but effective. They could last months without refrigeration and added variety to otherwise monotonous diets. Some nobles enjoyed elaborate pickled concoctions. Vinegar might be spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, making pickled vegetables a tiny spectacle of flavor. Even in preservation, status and taste mattered. Cold storage, ice, snow, and stone. Where available, cold storage was employed. Stone cellars, ice houses, and snow-packed pits provided natural refrigeration. Ice could be cut from frozen rivers in winter and stored in insulated pits to preserve meat or dairy for weeks. These techniques required careful planning. Ice had to be harvested, transported, and packed tightly to avoid melting.
Nobles might have entire staff dedicated to maintaining cold storage, while peasants relied on cool cellars, wells, or streams. Honey and sugar preservation. Honey and sugar weren't just sweets, they were preservatives. Meat could be glazed with honey to extend shelf life. Fruits could be cooked with sugar into jams and conserves. Even some pastries relied on sugar as a preservative. This dual role of honey and sugar, both indulgence and utility, highlights the medieval obsession with multifunctional food. Why have a dessert when it can also prevent spoilage? Practicality met extravagance. The challenges of long-term storage. Despite all these methods, medieval preservation was far from perfect. Mold, rot, and contamination were common. Spoiled food could spread illness quickly. Monks and physicians often wrote manuals detailing how to store food safely, but even the best instructions couldn't prevent every disaster. Grain infestations by weevils, moisture damage to salted meat, and overly fermented pickles were all hazards. Nobles could mitigate some risks by investing in storage techniques, but peasants often had to rely on luck and careful attention. Preservation was as much art as science, a slow, careful labor that required patience and diligence. Cultural and social implications. Food preservation had social significance. Nobles demonstrated their wealth and foresight by storing large quantities of preserved goods. Merchants profited by transporting salted fish, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables across regions. Even peasants who mastered preservation had a subtle form of status in their community. Skill at keeping food edible through winter was respected. Food preservation also influenced cuisine. Salting, smoking, and pickling shaped flavor profiles. Sweeteners like honey and sugar became intertwined with preservation techniques. The resulting flavors defined what we now consider medieval taste. The mundane work of storing food shaped culture, cuisine, and survival. Preservation as a reflection of human ingenuity. When we drift through this topic slowly, it's easy to forget how crucial preservation was. Every meal depended on foresight. Curing, smoking, brining, drying, storing, and rationing. Without these skills, starvation was inevitable. Monks recorded techniques meticulously. Cooks experimented, failed, and refined methods. Nobles demanded results. Peasants relied on tradition, and merchants profited from the excesses of both. Preservation was boring, essential, and quietly heroic. Floating thoughts. Imagine a stone cellar in winter, barrels of salted herring, smoked ham hanging from hooks, jars of pickled vegetables lining the walls, honey pots shining faintly in torchlight. Each item represents effort, ingenuity, and survival. Even the mundane act of storing food tells a story of labor, status, and the quiet rhythms of medieval life. And when you drift through the medieval world, you realize food wasn't just sustenance or indulgence, it was strategy. Every spice, every sweet, every preserved barrel reflected a careful balance of necessity, wealth, and taste.
So far, we've explored famine foods, royal excess, exotic spices, sweets, and preservation. Now it's time to slow drift into the more humble side of medieval dining, the daily sustenance of peasants. Because while nobles sipped spiced wine and admired sugar sculptures, peasants navigated gruel, pottage, and occasional meager delights. The backbone, pottage. Peasant meals revolved around pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat or fish. Pottage was flexible, nourishing, and practical.
It could simmer for hours, be reheated, and stretched to feed a family for multiple meals. Ingredients varied by season. In spring, peas, onions, and leeks might appear. Summer brought beans, cabbage, and garden herbs. Autumn introduced root vegetables and preserved foods. Winter relied on stored grains, dried legumes, and whatever salted or smoked meat survived from autumn. Flavor was minimal. Salt was scarce. Spices rarer still. Herbs might be added if available. Peasants ate pottage for calories, not pleasure. Think of it as edible fuel, sustenance to keep bodies moving and alive. Bread, daily staple. Bread was another central component of the peasant diet. Rye and barley were common grains. Wheat was rarer and often reserved for the wealthy. Bread could be dense, coarse, and occasionally sour if naturally fermented. Daily bread was practical, filling, calorie-dense, and relatively easy to produce. However, quality varied dramatically. During lean years, bread might include bark, bran, or other filler to stretch supplies. Yes, it could be tough, bland, and occasionally questionable, but it did the job. Cheese, eggs, and dairy. If available, dairy products supplemented meals. Cheese was common, usually hard or salted for preservation. Eggs were seasonal, and milk might be consumed fresh, fermented into buttermilk, or used for cooking. Dairy added calories and nutrients, but access was often limited. Peasants with cows, goats, or sheep had advantages. Those without had to rely on communal grazing or foraging, making milk and cheese a small but valuable luxury. Occasional meat and fish. Meat was rare for peasants. Livestock were often too valuable alive to eat. Cows for milk, pigs for lard, chickens for eggs. Hunting was typically restricted to nobility, leaving peasants dependent on small animals, eggs, or fish. Fish was important, especially during religious fasts when meat was forbidden. Rivers, ponds, and coastal regions provided freshwater or saltwater fish. Salted or smoked fish could last through winter, while fresh fish supplemented diets in warmer months. Seasonal and religious influences. Peasant diets followed the calendar closely. Fasting days, Lent, and religious holidays influenced what could be eaten. During fasts, meat was restricted, emphasizing fish, legumes, and vegetables. Feasts allowed small indulgences like pastries or sweetened bread, providing rare bursts of flavor. These moments were small, fleeting pleasures amidst the daily grind. Even modest enjoyment required planning, foraging, storing, and rationing, ensuring that occasional treats lasted. Pleasure was frugal, subtle, and seasonal, a quiet counterpoint to the extravagance of noble feasts. Food as survival. For peasants, food was rarely about flavor or luxury. It was life, energy, and survival. Monotony was practical. Nutrition was functional. Each meal was a careful balance of what was available, what could be stored, and what was necessary to keep bodies working in fields, workshops, or households. The risks of spoilage, scarcity, and famine were constant. Preservation, seasonal planning, and communal sharing were essential. Even small errors could have serious consequences. Eating was quiet, disciplined, and often repetitive. The social aspect of eating. Meals were social, even for peasants. Families gathered around a shared pot. Neighbors exchanged preserves, lent sugar, or traded salted fish. Knowledge about food, preservation, and preparation circulated within communities. Culinary skill was valued quietly, not as status, but as survival competence. Children learned young. They watched, imitated, and eventually contributed. Cooking, gathering, and storing food were integral to education. Meals became ritualized daily exercises in survival, patience, and community. Floating thoughts. Imagine a cold winter evening. A family huddles around a single pot of pottage, bread on the side, perhaps a spoonful of honey for flavor. The fire crackles, smoke rises from the hearth. Conversations are quiet. Life is repetitive, but rhythmic. Food is functional, survival-oriented, and occasionally comforting. Even amidst monotony, subtle pleasures exist. A well-made bread, a slightly sweetened porridge, a few foraged berries. These small joys punctuate the daily cycle. Compared to noble feasts, peasant meals were humble, repetitive, and rarely spectacular. Yet they were essential, deeply practical, and quietly human. Drifting to the next topic. As we float toward the next part of our slow historical journey, we can consider medieval feasts for towns and guilds, bridging the gap between peasant practicality and noble extravagance. These public meals reveal another layer of social dynamics, rituals, and the ways communities interacted with food.
We've meandered through noble indulgences, peasant survival, sweets, beverages, and preservation. Now let's drift into the middle ground: public feasts, guild banquets, and communal meals in towns and cities. Because while peasants ate modestly and nobles feasted extravagantly, townspeople had their own ritualized, slightly chaotic, yet surprisingly social dining experiences. Town feasts, celebration, and spectacle. Town feasts were often tied to religious festivals, market days, or civic celebrations. Unlike noble banquets, these meals were less about political power and more about community, ritual, and spectacle. Yet spectacle remained. Townspeople loved display, pageantry, and symbolic gestures. Food was central. Large pots of pottage, roasted meats, bread, cheese, and occasionally pastries were prepared in massive quantities. Spice was rare, sugar even rarer, but enough flourished to create a sense of abundance. Even humble ingredients could be transformed into celebratory dishes. Guild banquets, status, and networking. Guilds, associations of craftsmen, merchants, and artisans, hosted their own feasts. These were both social and professional occasions. Banquets marked annual meetings, the admission of new members, or the commemoration of a patron saint. Meals were structured. Seating arrangements often reflected hierarchy: master craftsmen sat at the head table, apprentices at the periphery. Food quality varied with rank. Meat was reserved for senior members, while younger members ate more modestly. Still, even basic pottage and bread were elevated by ritual, ceremony, and company. The role of alcohol. Ale, beer, and sometimes wine were ubiquitous at town and guild feasts. As with noble banquets, beverages were functional and social. Alcohol lubricated conversation, strengthened bonds, and added caloric value to otherwise simple meals. Overindulgence occurred, but consequences were usually minor compared to noble tables. A tipsy guild apprentice might embarrass himself, but he wouldn't trigger a dynastic crisis. Social dynamics remained subtle, yet observable. Who drank first, who poured for whom, and who ended up with the last cup of spiced wine. Public eating rituals. Public feasts emphasized ritual and spectacle over subtlety. Processions, songs, and small performances accompanied meals. Even simple dishes became performative. Roasted pigs might be presented with fanfare.
bread distributed ceremonially, or pies brought to tables with dramatic flair. Children and commoners often participated. Unlike noble feasts, where etiquette was strict, town banquets allowed more relaxed manners, occasional laughter, and communal sharing. Yet hierarchy persisted subtly. Wealthier or more respected citizens might receive better portions or preferred seating. Seasonal influences. Feasts followed the calendar. Spring celebrations featured fresh greens and eggs. Summer brought fruits, herbs, and fish. Autumn allowed roasted meats, preserved vegetables, and hearty pottages. Winter relied on salted or smoked meats, preserved fruits, and root vegetables. Seasonality shaped menu variety, storage needs, and cooking techniques. Public feasts became markers of time, communal achievement, and local pride, offering temporary relief from the monotony of daily peasant meals. Food quality and quantity. Food quality varied dramatically. Guilds with wealthy patrons could host impressive spreads, while smaller communities relied on simpler fare. Still, the emphasis was on volume and symbolism rather than refinement. Large quantities of modest food often created the impression of abundance, a critical element in communal morale. Even peasants attending these feasts experienced subtle luxury. A slice of sweet bread, a chunk of cheese, or a small portion of roasted meat was a rare indulgence. Shared with friends and neighbors, it became social currency, festive pleasure, and tiny luxury all at once. Hygiene and logistics. Organizing town feasts presented challenges. Open-air cooking, large crowds, and minimal sanitation created risk of spoilage and contamination. Yet towns developed rudimentary strategies, elevated tables, communal utensils, and staged serving to reduce chaos. Despite these measures, mishaps were inevitable. Spilled ale, burnt pottage, or minor foodborne illness. Attendees accepted these as part of the experience, a slow, gentle tolerance of imperfection, far removed from modern hygiene standards. Guild banquet specialties. Guilds often showcased their craft through food. Bakers might provide ornate bread, confectioners sugar sculptures, and butchers impressive cuts of roasted meat. Feasts reflected the guild's identity, skill, and pride. Some guilds even competed. Who could roast the largest pig, bake the most intricate pastry, present the most imaginative ale punch? Subtle rivalry ensured meals were both functional and performative, providing entertainment alongside nourishment. Feasting as social glue. Public meals reinforced community, hierarchy, and collective identity. They allowed townspeople to celebrate shared achievements, honor patrons, or mark the passage of time. While food itself was often simple, its role in ritual, entertainment, and networking was significant. Children learned social norms. Apprentices observed hierarchy. Neighbors exchanged food, advice, and gossip. In these settings, eating became a vehicle for cultural transmission, civic pride, and quiet joy, all conveyed slowly, ceremonially, and without dramatic fanfare. Floating thoughts. Picture a cool evening in a medieval town square. Long wooden tables laden with steaming pottage, roasted poultry, and baskets of coarse bread. The ale flows. Children run between tables. Apprentices attempt to carve meat under the watchful eye of masters. Songs float from a nearby corner. Candles and torches flicker. The air smells of roasting, baking, and smoke. Life is neither luxurious nor perfectly hygienic. It is repetitive, ceremonial, and human. Every gesture, breaking bread, passing a cup, tasting a spiced pudding, reflects survival, community, and small, quiet pleasures. Even without royal pomp or peasant monotony, town feasts provide insight into medieval daily life, social cohesion, and the cultural importance of shared meals. They are simultaneously practical, performative, and hypnotically slow when narrated at bedtime.
We've wandered through peasant meals, royal extravagance, sweets, preservation, and public feasts. Now let's float into the world of spices and exotic foods, ingredients that were rare, costly, and often more about prestige than taste. Because even in the slow, repetitive life of the Middle Ages, humans loved novelty, rarity, and subtle sensory indulgence. The spice trade, status in a bottle. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron. These weren't mere seasonings. They were status symbols, currency, and subtle weapons of social signaling. Imported from Asia, the Middle East, and islands like the Moluccas, spices were expensive. A pinch could cost as much as a loaf of bread or a jug of wine. Spices were used to flaunt wealth. A noble might demand that every dish at a banquet be spiced extravagantly, not for flavor, necessarily, but to demonstrate global connections and economic power. Even a small merchant family might showcase exotic pepper or saffron at a festival feast, subtly asserting sophistication. Exotic ingredients and culinary curiosity. Beyond spices, exotic foods fascinated Europeans. Sugar, as we've discussed, was rare. Dried fruits, nuts, and imported fish also commanded attention. Dishes were sometimes designed as much to impress as to nourish. Wealthy cooks experimented. Recipes combined sweet, sour, and spicy elements in ways that might seem bizarre today. Meat stews could include ginger, cinnamon, raisins, and sugar. Poultry might be stuffed with almonds and rosewater. Flavor, spectacle, and rarity were intertwined. Spice as medicine. Spices were also believed to have medicinal properties. Pepper could aid digestion, saffron was warming, ginger stimulating, cinnamon thought to balance humors. Monks, physicians, and alchemists often prescribed spice-laden dishes as preventative or restorative medicine. This dual role, both culinary and medical, amplified the allure of rare ingredients. Eating a peppered stew wasn't just enjoyable, it was supposed to ward off illness, melancholy, or imbalance. Practicality, prestige, and subtle snobbery coexisted in a single bite. Royal spice obsessions. Monarchs had their favorite spices. Some demanded specific origins: cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from India, saffron from Spain. Kitchens stocked spices meticulously, often under lock and key. Misuse could lead to subtle scandal or minor royal displeasure. Young royals, too, could develop particular obsessions. A queen might insist on dishes with exactly 3 cloves, a pinch of ginger, and a dash of sugar. A king could refuse anything unless spiced to his precise specifications. Kitchens operated under quiet anxiety, anticipating moods, whims, and the subtle pressures of status. Exotic meats and fish. Exotic ingredients weren't limited to spices. Wealthy Europeans consumed unusual meats: swans, peacocks, venison, and game birds. These were often displayed theatrically, served whole, and sometimes adorned with sugar or spices for added spectacle. Fish from distant rivers or seas also commanded attention. Salted cod, dried herring, and freshwater varieties were preserved, transported, and incorporated into feasts.
Nobles prized rare fish during religious fasts, adding both novelty and subtle prestige to meals. Presentation and theater. Exotic foods were often more visual than practical. Sugar sculptures, gilded pastries, and elaborately arranged meats functioned as edible arts. Guests admired aesthetics, reflected on a wealth and taste, and occasionally sampled the creations, if brave enough. Even ordinary dishes received embellishments. Herbs, rare nuts, or dried fruits could transform a simple pottage into a symbol of sophistication. Presentation mattered as much as flavor, subtly reinforcing hierarchy and cultural refinement. Merchants and the spread of spices. Merchants played a key role. Their networks brought spices, sugar, and exotic goods from distant lands to European tables. They profited from rarity, cultivated taste, and navigated politics, tariffs, and transport hazards. Guilds of spice merchants often became powerful, influencing pricing, availability, and culinary trends. A wealthy merchant could subtly shape the eating habits of an entire town or region by controlling access to rare ingredients. Floating thoughts. Picture a medieval kitchen. Sacks of pepper, cinnamon sticks, jars of saffron, and honeyed almonds ready for dessert. Chefs measure, grind, and blend, anticipating subtle royal moods. The air smells warm, pungent, and faintly sweet. Cooks work slowly, carefully, quietly. Each dish is a small act of prestige, experiment, and ritualized patience. Even for those not wealthy enough to afford exotic spices, the influence was pervasive. Local herbs, honey, dried fruit, and modest sugar allowed imitation of noble flavors. Subtle ambition and culinary curiosity spread slowly but steadily across classes. Spice as cultural marker. Spices and exotic ingredients marked not just wealth, but cosmopolitanism, taste, and sophistication. Their presence indicated knowledge of trade routes, skill in cooking, and understanding of social rituals. The subtle contrast between noble extravagance and peasant imitation highlights medieval society's complex relationship with food. Even the smallest morsel, a pinch of cinnamon in a modest bun, reflected centuries of trade, cultural aspiration, and quiet obsession. Food, in this sense, became a slow, flavorful mirror of society.
We've meandered through peasant meals, noble feasts, sweets, preservation, town banquets, and exotic spices. Now let's flow into the rules, rituals, and subtle performances of dining etiquette in the Middle Ages, because even the most mundane meals were often structured, symbolic, and socially instructive. Tables and seating. Dining was hierarchical, subtle, and often painfully structured. Nobles sat at the high table. Their closest advisors, family, or honored guests were nearby. Lesser nobles, retainers, and servants occupied lower tables or the floor. Even placement of a chair or cushion signaled social rank. For guilds and towns, similar patterns emerged. Masters and officials received better seating. Apprentices and novices were further away. While peasants might eat communally with less formal hierarchy, subtleties still existed. Older, more respected villagers might be seated at the head of a bench, signaling quiet authority. Utensils and tableware. Forks were rare, knives and spoons dominated. Bowls, plates, and cups varied in material, wood, pewter, or occasionally ceramic for the wealthy. Even small differences, a wooden bowl versus a pewter dish, carried social significance.
Using utensils correctly mattered. A noble might subtly judge a guest for sloppy cutting, poor use of a spoon, or excessive hand-to-mouth contact. Apprentices and younger diners learned by observation. Eating properly was a slow, careful form of education in social conformity. Hands, mouths, and food handling. Hands were acceptable tools, especially for bread and meat, but there were rules. Picking up food with the left hand, wiping your mouth carelessly, or eating too quickly could be considered slightly uncouth. Conversely, slow, deliberate consumption reflected refinement. Bread often served a dual purpose, as food and as a plate. Guests might use thick slices to soak up sauces or serve as a base for meat. The act of handling bread carefully became a subtle ritual of practicality and manners. Eating order and ritual. Meals followed a subtle order. Soup or pottage came first, followed by meat, poultry, or fish. Desserts, fruits, or pastries ended the meal. Timing and sequence mattered, not for taste alone, but as performance. Eating too quickly or out of order could suggest impatience, greed, or ignorance. In town and guild settings, rituals included blessings, toasts, or songs. Nobles might expect formal grace, a short prayer, or ceremonial breaking of bread. Observing these rituals correctly demonstrated piety, respect, and awareness of social norms. Spices, sauces, and subtle judgments. Use of spices or sauces was not just culinary, but social signaling. A delicate pinch of saffron or a subtle hint of pepper displayed sophistication. Overuse might suggest vulgarity. Underuse, ignorance. Guests, chefs, and hosts navigated these cues carefully. Even small gestures, passing a salt dish correctly, offering wine first to a higher-ranking guest, reinforced hierarchy and ritual. Dining became a slow dance of observation, subtlety, and quiet compliance. Conversation at the table. Talking during meals was acceptable, but content and tone mattered. Nobles expected polite conversation, anecdotes, or instructive stories. Loud laughter, quarrels, or interruptions were discouraged. In town feasts, conversation was more relaxed, but still subtly regulated. Apprentices observed speech norms, neighbors exchanged updates carefully, and everyone learned through quiet participation. Meals were classrooms in civility, ritual, and social awareness. Table staff and service. Servants played a critical role. They carved, poured, and distributed food, maintaining ritual and order. In noble households, mistakes could elicit subtle disapproval. In town or guild settings, efficiency mattered more than performance, but service still reflected respect and social knowledge. The invisible choreography of dining, knives placed correctly, wine poured at the right moment, dishes delivered in sequence, kept meals flowing slowly, predictably, and comfortably for sleep-inducing storytelling purposes. Floating thoughts. Imagine a noble hall, tapestries dimly lit by candles, bowls of pottage and platters of roasted meat arrayed on the high table. Guests sit carefully, observing subtle cues. Who was eating first? Who reaches for the salt? Who wipes their mouth correctly? Conversation is calm, rhythmic, polite. The air smells of roasted meat, spiced sauces, and beeswax from candles. Even minor gestures, a spoon lifted, a piece of bread torn correctly, carry weight, ritual, and subtle education. Meals were performances teaching manners, hierarchy, and social subtlety. In town or guild halls, the scene is more relaxed. Apprentice and master share tables, ale flows, bread and cheese pass from hand to hand. Yet hierarchy, ritual, and observation persist quietly. The rhythm is slower, less formal, but still instructive, ceremonial, and socially meaningful. Drifting to the next topic, In Part 16, we'll explore the decline of extreme medieval dining extravagance, the slow changes in taste, and how culinary culture gradually shifted toward modern sensibilities. Because after centuries of ritualized, sometimes absurd eating, society began subtly questioning, simplifying, and reordering its relationship with food.
So far, we've floated through peasant meals, noble feasts, guild banquets, exotic spices, and intricate etiquette. Now it's time to explore how extreme medieval dining slowly softened, simplified, and shifted toward early modern tastes. Because even in a world obsessed with status, ritual, and spectacle, change arrived quietly, one subtle shift at a time. Overabundance meets practicality. By the late Middle Ages, some nobles began noticing the practical limits of access. Banquets required enormous staff, mountains of ingredients, and meticulous organization. The tiniest misstep could result in spoiled dishes, wasted meat, or minor embarrassment. Some forward-thinking kitchens began to favor simpler menus, fewer courses, more practical use of local ingredients, and restrained seasoning. This was partly a response to cost. Transporting exotic spices remained expensive, but also a quiet acknowledgement that spectacle alone was exhausting. Influence of trade and ingredients. Global trade continued to expand. Exotic ingredients became slightly more available, but slowly. Sugar, spices, and dried fruits began to trickle into town markets more frequently. As accessibility improved, the shock value of rare spices diminished. Cooks gradually blended extravagance with practicality. A dish might still be impressive, but it relied more on freshness, quality, and clever combinations, rather than sheer rarity or cost. Subtle flavor layering replaced the overwhelming spectacle of cinnamon, sugar, ginger, and saffron, all in a single stew. Health and humor. Medical theory still influenced eating habits, but slowly caution crept in. Overly rich, spiced, or sweet foods were sometimes blamed for illness or moral weakness. Physicians, monks, and wise women recommended moderation. Even nobles began listening, reluctantly, but occasionally. Banquets adjusted, less sugar, more vegetables, and careful pacing. Dining became less hazardous to digestion, quieter, and less about flaunting global connections in every bite. The rise of regional identity. Culinary culture began to emphasize local identity. Towns, regions, and even individual households began celebrating native ingredients. Meat, fish, grains, and vegetables from nearby fields became prominent, often prepared with modest seasoning. Regional cuisine allowed for pride, flavor, and practicality to coexist. Nobles and merchants still displayed status, but now skillful preparation and local knowledge mattered as much as rarity or expense. Tables, staff, and rituals simplify. The labor-intensive choreography of medieval feasts began to ease. Fewer servers were needed, seating arrangements became less rigid, and utensils more standardized. Table manners retained importance, but strict ceremonial performances were increasingly reserved for major festivals or royal events. For everyday nobles, guilds, or wealthy merchants, dining became functional yet polite. Ritual persisted, but with less pressure, less formality, and more flexibility for human comfort. Sweetness and spice shift. Sugar remained a luxury, but its presence in daily diets became slightly less ostentatious. Spices, once overwhelmingly abundant at feasts, were now used more judiciously, enhancing flavor rather than signaling extreme wealth. This subtle recalibration reflects a shift in taste, sophistication, and perception.
Exotic ingredients were still admired, but skillful moderation replaced flamboyant opulence. Culinary subtlety quietly eclipsed sheer opulence. Peasants and townspeople. While nobles and guilds moderated their tastes, peasants and townspeople continued gradual integration of new ingredients. Sugars, spices, dried fruits, and refined breads slowly entered modest kitchens. Techniques borrowed from elite kitchens, simmering, slow roasting, preservation, improved ordinary diets. This diffusion of culinary knowledge helped normalize flavor, variety, and subtlety, setting the stage for early modern European cuisine. Monotony softened, practical indulgence increased, and modest pleasure became more accessible and sustainable. Floating thoughts. Imagine a late 15th century noble hall, a banquet still impressive, but calmer, quieter, and slightly smeller. Fewer courses, carefully chosen spices, and regional ingredients dominate. Staff moves efficiently, without anxiety. Guests eat slowly, appreciate subtle flavors, and occasionally sip wine with polite conversation. In town guild halls, banquets retain charm, rhythm, and communal engagement, but with less chaos, more practicality, and slightly improved flavor. Even peasants occasionally benefit from new techniques and ingredients, quietly enjoying small enhancements to daily meals. Cultural significance. The decline of extreme extravagance wasn't dramatic or sensational. It was subtle, gradual, and influenced by economics, health, trade, and changing taste. Feasts became calmer, more sustainable, and socially practical, while retaining their ceremonial and symbolic roles. Even minor shifts, like using a smaller quantity of sugar, emphasizing local herbs, or simplifying seating arrangements, carried cultural weight. They reflect human adaptation, aesthetic evolution, and slow social reform through food. Drifting to the next topic. In Part 17, we'll explore the personal quirks, eccentric diets, and food obsessions of specific historical figures, from minor nobles to eccentric kings. Because after centuries of ritualized, practical, and evolving cuisine, the human dimension of taste, preference, and obsession offers quiet fascination for sleep-inducing storytelling.